So let's just make sure that happened. Okay. So I pulled together some examples, just simply of writing themes. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So maybe some of you have gone through and you have a workable list of your codes. If not, you'll get there, I promise. Once you get that laundry list of codes, trying to plug them in or come up with different descriptions or categories, if you will. And just this was more for me, but kind of reviewing. I'm trying to catch myself of saying kind of a lot, like kind of reviewing. No, reviewing. I'm reviewing the APA guidelines on figures, and this was more for me because, as you know, we have the 6th edition of APA, and as faculty that I know of, we've agreed to follow through with that with you guys so that we're not, making you learn APA 6th edition and now switching to 7th edition. But I was curious on what has changed, if anything has changed with that 7th edition. And so I found some checklists of just simple things that should be included when you're creating a figure. So I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. I also found a resource, actually Dr. Siblis shared it with me on maybe for some of those of you who are doing qualitative interviews. Some of you are writing your qualitative scripts right now and your interview guides. And so I wanted to bring that to everybody's attention too. I feel like that might be a good resource for you to look at as you're creating those. So we'll talk about writing qualitative results next year sometime. So this is, when you're writing the qualitative results, you're going to describe the results in your results section of your manuscript. Okay, and we're not there yet, right? This is just simply an in-class activity. But your results section of qualitative tend to be very, very, very long. And when you write your thematic statement, in your results section, you're going to be breaking that thematic statement down and using different quotes to support those specific thematic statements. Okay. Something worth mentioning when we write up that qualitative piece, when we're using quotations, make sure that we're looking in that APA manual for block quotations of greater than 40 words. And that's the 6th edition. This is the part where I wanted to highlight for the sake of our assignment. It's helpful to display our results in a figure to explain how or perhaps why you completed the analysis the way you did. So further in your narrative, you're going to explain this process and refer in your write-up in the results section how you went or how you analyzed your data, how you created codes, how those codes condensed into categories, and how those categories created themes. Again, if you're doing the thematic analysis. So in your IRB proposal, if you are doing a qualitative piece or you are doing a mixed methods with a qualitative piece to it, you'll be briefly explaining that you plan on coding your transcripts, that you plan on reducing your transcript, or you plan on reducing your repetitive codes. From your code list, you will create categories. From your categories, you will collapse them into overarching themes of all of your interviews. Okay, so you'll have to write out what your planned process is. Now, for the sake of our assignment, this is what I'm going to be grading, right? The ACOTE standard is that everybody does some sort of qualitative analysis where you're taking large amounts of data and you're condensing that into something meaningful, such as themes. So I wanted to give you another example, maybe a different example. You've all saw the example that I shared in that publication about international service learning. This example was from a mixed methods publication that Dr. Sibla and I had published a few years ago. I believe it was in 2016. But a couple of things about this figure is the journal editor, the editor of the journal that we submitted to, took it and reconfigured it. So you'll see figure 1, data analysis, that is centered and on the bottom. You'll refer to APA format where figure 1, data analysis, should be left aligned. And so there's a little bit of discrepancy here with APA format, but I thought it was a good example of on the left-hand side, we have the codes that we used. Okay, those codes then plugged into those categories or descriptions in the middle. Then those descriptions in the middle led to individual themes. So the example I shared with you before with international service learning, those different categories formed relationships, kind of lumped together, if you will, to form one theme. It didn't work that way in this study. Okay? Each of these themes came from an individual category. So don't think that we would have to lump routine and sensory processing and come up with one theme for that. Okay, we can create one theme with one category. So that's going to be up to you to decide. And I'm not going to say, oh, no, these should have been condensed, right? That's not how qualitative research works. It emerges. You do what makes sense to you and with what your findings are. And because you're going through all of your transcripts, all of your interviews, and you're so close to that data set, it's going to make sense, I promise you. And I feel like students get anxious that they're not doing it right. And I promise you, it will be right to you, okay? So again, looking at the left-hand side, and again, if I'm following APA format, up on top, I would have codes, right? Which then below here are a list of all of my code words. Again, the editor took that out for whatever reason, didn't have room, I don't know. So trial and error was a code word. Structure was a code word. Routine was a code word. Quiet time was a code word. Communication, patience, avoiding conflict. All of those were code words. So I had to sit back and think, what did all of these code words have in common? What were they talking about? What were they talking about when I coded trial and error? Okay, now I had some excellent conversations with some of you last week in our small group discussion about how do you code, right? And I said, hey, some of you might code trial and error. You might code that as thinking on your feet, right? Or problem solving or whatever. It doesn't matter. It does not matter, because if you came up with that code word, you're going to know what it means from your data, right? So for me, I coded it trial and error. I coded structure, routine. What did all of those have in common? What were they all talking about? What was the meaning underneath all of those that was common? And that was routine. So caregivers, in this study, just to give it a little preface, was a mixed method study where we interviewed caregivers of children who've experienced trauma. Most of them were foster parents, okay? We also, as part of the quantitative data, gave caregivers the sensory profile caregiver questionnaire. So we had that part was the quantitative part. We did interviews. That was the qualitative part. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop here. So trial and error, trying one thing, it didn't work, you try another thing. That's what they were talking about, okay, when coming up with daily routines. Well, that didn't work, having breakfast at 5 a.m. We had to have breakfast at 8 a.m. because that's when they woke up, and they were super crabby and throwing things if we had to wake them up earlier. So creating structure. We had to follow this certain order every single day for 6 months so that our child would behave appropriately. Okay, following routine. They talked a lot about we had to do the same thing every single day, or we had to incorporate quiet time every single day just to allow our child to decompress. Okay, so all of these things on the left-hand side lumped into routine. Okay, now when coming up with a theme or a thematic statement, it's been my experience, and it might be different for other preceptors, but things kind of emerge. And I am saying kind of there, like they emerge, right? They may not emerge right away. I noticed a lot of these themes came about when I would have trouble falling asleep at night. Yes, that's what everything had in common. That's what everything had. That's what they were talking about when talking about routine. And then I would go back to my transcripts, and how many of these caregivers actually said this about routine. And then I would go back to my code words that I lumped under routine, and I would be able to find the different quotes. This particular editor of this journal wanted me to quantify, which is so not qualitative, but they wanted me to quantify exactly how many caregivers voiced the importance. And so that's where you're seeing every caregiver voice the importance of providing structure and routine to their children's daily life in order to prevent challenging behaviors. Okay, so that's the thematic statement that I came up with. Behaviors, morning, bedtime, routine. Again, you do see some of the same codes, right? You do see some of the same codes, but what's the underlying meaning of some of those codes also? It had to do with sensory processing. Okay, not every caregiver stated this, I would say, and I can't remember what I said in my write-up, but most of the caregivers voiced sensory aversions that occurred on a daily basis that affected their children's ability to complete daily routines. So what is that overarching theme? And you're writing a description of it that everybody or most of the people are saying and getting at. And you're putting that into your own words. Okay. So again, you can see on my last example, it was very clear that new experiences, I think, was the code word or the description, right? And emotions, that was another description. Well, what were they talking about with their emotions? Well, every new experience created just a wide variety of emotions. Okay, so that again kind of ties into the last example, and this is yet another a different example. Okay, parts of a figure. So make sure that you number every figure. Obviously, you guys are going to have figure 1. Okay, so all figures that are part of the main text require a number with a numeral. So figure 1, okay, figure 2 if you have an additional figure. Numbers are assigned based on the order in which they appear in the text. They're bolded and left aligned. So figure 1 is bold. Underneath the number, so you'll hit return and it'll be double spaced, and then you'll have the title of your figure. So most of you, I would guess, would say thematic analysis or data analysis. And you're going to italicize the title of your figure. It should be brief, clear, explanatory, and both the title and the number should be double spaced. So title or figure 1, return, double spaced, data analysis, which should be italicized. Underneath that will also be double spaced, and then is your actual image. Okay, now some of this is, again, you should try and have 8 to 14 point font, sans serif, whatever that means. I think Arial, Times New Roman are considered time or sans serif fonts, those kinds of things. So in my examples I gave you, again, on top, you could have codes and then your list of code words, categories, and then your list of categories. And you saw how I created just a chart with the grid lines just to separate out and to clarify that those codes align with those particular categories. Okay, and so that's okay in a figure. A table, not so much. A table, you don't want many grid lines at all. Underneath the figure, you could have notes if you need to clarify the content of the figure. I think if you use the title qualitative data analysis or thematic analysis or data analysis, that's going to tell me exactly what I see. And so I don't think you necessarily need notes, but just to hold true to APA format, they do have a note section. Again, for the assignment, you don't need to put that. Okay, but I included it here because it is part of that. Again, it's a note is to clarify the content of the figure, but if you're putting data analysis, I don't think you need to clarify. I hope that's not confusing. Here's just a simple checklist. Is the figure necessary? For the sake of the assignment, it's going to be necessary. Because that proves to me that you guys took a lot of data and you somehow figured out how to do a structured analysis of all that data. Okay. Does the figure belong in print, or does it belong in the electronic version of the article? Okay, well, again, this is just out of the APA manual, and it's a guide to whether or not you should use a figure. You have to create a figure for your assignment. So yes, it's going to belong in a figure. Is the figure simple, clean, and free of extraneous detail? So you saw my figure is very plain, right? It uses those grid lines again to show, do those codes condense or collapse, or how do I create those codes into a category? So to me, that's very clean. It's simple. It seems to be easy to understand. That's how I've done both figures for my publications, and both journal editors liked them. So that's my experience. Creswell does do it a little bit differently. That's okay too. I'm just showing you my experience. Is the title of the figure descriptive? Data analysis. Well, that should be pretty descriptive. Okay. Is it written in italics? Okay. Is it left aligned? Are the elements of the figure clearly labeled? So this is where the journal editor took that piece out, right? He took out codes, or the code word or codes, right? He took out categories, he took out themes. And so you want to make sure that your figure, it's clear what those columns are labeled as. Is the magnitude, scale, direction of the grid elements clear? Again, code, categories, themes, or if you want to use descriptions instead of categories, that's fine. Are parallel figures equally important? And using the same scale? Are figure numbers are they numbered? So everybody, do they have figure 1? Okay, has the figure been formatted properly? Are there any abbreviations that need to be explained? I don't think anybody will have a legend for their qualitative data analysis. In the text, when you're writing, and you're not writing anything for your assignment, but if you were to take this data analysis piece and this figure, you would have to say in your write-up and your results, refer to figure 1 for an explanation of how data analysis was completed. Okay, something like that. So you're referring to the figure in the text. If you're using a photograph or any other type of figure, make sure that you identify that you've gotten permission. If you've given modifications to anything, make sure that's disclosed. Again, not necessarily applicable to your figure, but I want it to be comprehensive with what's being said about figures. Again, making sure that if you do have a figure and it's a picture of something, that it's high resolution. So again, I just created this in a Word document. I thought that was probably the easiest. You'll see everything is left aligned so that it's nice and clean. Okay, so my codes are left aligned, my categories are left aligned, and my themes are left aligned. So that is just some, again, another example of themes, how I got to those themes, another example of a figure, if you will, and some checklists of how to format a figure for your analysis. Are there any questions about that?
I had one quick one.
Yes.
On your figure, the word behaviors was on 2 different like chunks or categories. Are we allowed to put the same word to 2 different categories?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So when I'm looking at, now you don't want to, constantly repeat, right? But there are times when I'm looking at coding the word behaviors, there were certain behaviors that were being talked about. So there were behaviors that were relating to, and this was part of my analysis being an OT. There was a story about a little girl who would not wear underwear. She would tug at her waistband of her underpants and just get really irritable when she would wear them. The family would get larger underwear for her and they would ball up and bunch, and she didn't like those. And so she would actually go to the bathroom and take them off or have major meltdowns every morning when they made her put on underwear. Okay. And so when I'm looking at that and I coded that as a behavior, having to deal with morning routine, right? Having issues with getting dressed every morning. Well, we have to get dressed every morning as part of our daily routine. So that behavior fit underneath the category of behavior or of routine, right? But as an OT, what else signifies that, or what else is some meaning to that behavior? Probably some tactile defensiveness, right? Or some sensory processing issues. And so when I looked at my code words, I saw some of those codes, like behaviors, could fit underneath morning routine because that's what it was describing, part of difficulty with morning routine. But it also had meaning to it relating to sensory processing and particularly defensiveness. Can you believe I remember that after 3 years? That is the magic of qualitative data, you guys. It is the magic of it. You are so immersed in it and it becomes so meaningful to you that you remember these stories because they're the backdrop of everything. And it's just magical. So that's a good question. Any other questions about that? I wanted to just share this resource with you. Also, again, I got this from Dr. Sibla. Now I've gotten about 5 emails from students who have asked me to look at their qualitative interview guides for their parts of their study. And I think that's great. That's wonderful. Dr. Sibla sent this to me the other day and I went through it and I actually like this. I think it's a great resource, a great tool. Little bit better maybe than the phenomenological interview ones. It's a little bit more specific than the readings that I had posed. So I added this for all of you guys to review, particularly those of you who are doing qualitative analysis. And I know, or qualitative interviews. And I know some of you already have this resource from Dr. Sibla, but just a couple things to point out, okay, when you're doing interviews. We've talked about some of this already, right? It's not a survey. You're not drilling them, right? You're having to use active listening. So I think we've covered that already. Most of you are being told that you will have to record your interviews to assure accuracy. Okay, so that's great. So I'm going to skip that part. A successful interviewer is So here are some really good tips. I think we really talked about a lot of these already. So it's good, I think, to just look back at it. Maybe some of you, as you were doing the assignment or the interviews for this assignment, you can kind of you can reflect on some of these. The interviewer as a social or interview as a social piece or interpersonal encounter. You're dealing with people, right? So really being in tune to your nonverbal body language. If somebody says something you don't expect and you wear your heart on your sleeve like I do, they're gonna know if you're judging them or anything like that. So things that I really liked about this particular section, and we talked about active listening, but sometimes when we're active listening, there are times when I've done interviews and I've zoned out, right? Because I'm trying to analyze, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to do many things at once. And so, oh, can you repeat that again? Or, oh, that sounds really important. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Okay, and so again, that's an active listening technique. Sometimes the first few interviews that I did, people would think, and then I would jump in and try and reword the question. They may not need rewording, they may just have to be thinking. And so don't be afraid of pause or silence, and don't be afraid to tell your participant, hey, it's okay to think about it. So don't feel like you're awkward, or don't make them awkward if they need a second to think about it. That's okay. Here's the meat of what I wanted to get at. Questions should be simple. Okay, don't ask more than one question at a time. So that's something I think Dr. Sibla gave her group some feedback, where I gave them feedback of, ask your participants, what are pros and cons? Okay, and Dr. Sibla's like, no, only ask them one at a time, pros or cons. And my rationale behind that was, if you ask them pros and cons right up front, you're not guiding them to only focus on one or the other. So I thought by saying pros and cons, it would be less of a leading question or less bias that way. And then you have to listen and ask them, okay, if they focus on cons, to perhaps ask them and a follow-up question on, okay, you've identified some cons, now let's revisit that and go back to pros. So again, maybe you'll get some different feedback from different people. And I'm always so paranoid that I'm going to give a group feedback and then their preceptor is going to say, no, that's crap, or no, what are you thinking? And then the student's going to be like, oh, but Dr. Lawson said this and blah, blah, blah. So it puts me in an awkward situation, and I'm more than happy to share, and I want to share my experiences, but I just feel like I need to preface to everybody that they may have different experiences. Okay, and it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means that it's different. The best questions are those which elicit the longest answers. So you don't want to have a closed-ended question of, how did that make you feel? Happy. How did that make you feel? Sad. Did you do this? No. Did you do that? Yes. Okay, so open that question up a little bit. Tell me about your experiences with. Okay, so that's going to open up that question, and it's going to elicit a longer response, more than just one word. Don't ask questions that require your respondents to do the analysis for you, because this is your job. Okay, so this means that you don't want to say, so a lot of our research questions have to do with how and in what ways did your participant experience something? So you don't want to just turn around and say, how and in what ways did you experience international service learning? Or what was your motivation for wanting to conduct international service learning? Okay, that's making them analyze everything. You're going to want to ask them questions, and it's your job that's going to analyze that on how did that make your client feel? Okay, well, they told me this, 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 this. Okay, so I'm thinking that they were feeling anxious. Okay, you can analyze that. Again, you don't want to ask your clients hearsay or your participants any hearsay or opinions. What do people around here think of working for, working for the boss? Okay, it's going to put them in an awkward position. Types of questions or interview talk. So direct questions. Again, some of these are yes or no questions. I think I told Dr. Sibla's group that sometimes in qualitative interviews, it's okay to ask a direct question, but you have to prepare for whether or not you need to follow or what your follow-up is. So if somebody says yes, okay, what are your follow-up questions going to be to that? If somebody says no, what are your follow-up questions going to be to that no response? So if you do ask a direct or a closed question, and sometimes there are occasions where that is needed, but you'll have to create a script or something to prepare for if they're going to say either or. Using indirect questions in order to get to the individual's viewpoint. Sometimes you need to come back to restructure your interview. So if they go back to a follow, or if they go on to a really long story that doesn't get at the heart of your interview question, you can restructure them and say, well, let's go back to the question, right? That's going to restructure them. Or now we're going to move to a different topic and talk about workplace stress. Okay, and so then you're preparing them to move on to maybe a different topic other than what they've been told. Again, follow-up questions, you're trying to elicit longer responses from them. So getting them to elaborate. Because I'm an OT and I interviewed OTs, I received a lot of responses that were, well, it was kind of like, So I would have to follow up with them and say, yes, I think I know, but I'd really like to hear it from you. So can you explain that further? Or can you tell me about a time, or can you explain it to me like I would not know? So again, I wouldn't want them to assume that I knew what their experience was. I had to pull their teeth to get them to actually say it, not literally pull their teeth, but I had to really use those follow-up questions. Again, a probing question is maybe a follow-up question that has been said through direct questioning. So if you're using a direct question, are you happy with the way you and your husband decide how money should be spent? No, I'm not. So then you would want to probe that a little bit, right? Well, can you tell me about an example of when, or how you decide, how you and your husband decide how money should be spent? Can you share me a specific example? Okay. Specifying questions, interpreting questions, I think are important too. So you might hear people beat around the bush about a certain topic. So an interpreting question might be, what I'm hearing you say is that you have some stressors in your work. Is it fair to say that your work gives you stress from time to time? And then they would say yes. So then that would, or maybe no, I don't know. But you're interpreting what they're saying so that you can be more clear with what it is that they're trying to tell you. Again, some people beat around the bush and you understand they're trying to say something, but you want to make sure they're going on record, if you will. I think of a news reporter, and you want to make sure you're not putting words in their mouth, but you want them to directly say what it is that they mean. Okay, so those are some really good ways or types of questions when you're thinking about your interview questions. And I really liked this section too. a step-by-step guide for writing interview questions. So again, and this is, I think, compatible to what we've talked a little bit about, writing down the larger research questions of the study. So those should always be in the forefront of our mind, right? That's why I'm having you write the research question of this assignment on the very top of your assignment. So it's right there for everybody to see right off the get-go. So picking apart that interview or picking apart those research questions and just what are different components of them? Okay, so different components. I have Rachel up on my screen right now, and so I'm using Dr. Sibla's group. But from my memory, going off of their research question, they had different things about their first job. Okay, the experiences of their first job, their first setting. So that was a component to write an interview question about, getting them to reflect on that. Okay, another aspect of their interview question is to come up with their expectations of their job. Okay, another component of their research question had to come up with workplace stress. And another component had to come up with coping with workplace stress. And so when you pick apart their research question, they have to come up with specific interview questions that follow each of those components of their research question. Okay. Adjust the language of the interview according to the respondent. Take care to word questions so that they're motivated to answer as completely and honestly. You want to ask questions how rather than why. When you ask why questions, some people shut down because they feel interrogated. But when you ask how questions, you get more description from them. Again, probing questions may elicit more detail or elaboration. So again, the more detail, the better. You want them to tell you stories. You want them to share examples. You want them to really share a lot more. We talked already about starting that question with a warm-up question. Okay, thinking about the logical flow of the interview. What topic should come first? So again, when I met with Dr. Sibla's group, we want to talk about their current experience or reflecting back on their first job first, right? And then we want to get down more to the nitty gritty later on, maybe the more difficult or potentially embarrassing questions to ask later on in the interview about stress, okay? And then the last question, again, you want to really try and find a last question that leaves the respondent feeling empowered, listened to, otherwise glad they talked to you. Again, I think Creswell talks about that last question should be, what else am I missing that I should be asking you? What else do you want to share? Okay, what else can you tell me about your experience that maybe I'm missing? So that's really empowering your participant to feel like they are the expert, and they are the expert, right, with their topic, with their experience. And so that's an example, I think, that ties in nicely to our Creswell assignment. So again, this is just a tool. It's a PDF attachment. I added it later this morning underneath my simple little outline. So I'm hoping that this helps you guys as some of you are starting to create your interview guide. What are your questions? Where are you guys at with your assignment, your analysis assignment? Do you all have a laundry list of codes? You can just give me a thumbs up, if you will, or a thumbs down. I know I can't see everybody, but okay. So how many of you have created categories or descriptions? Okay, so that's kind of what you're working on. A lot of you are working on that now. That's perfect. Did today help at all with another example of how to lump or create or come up with those categories? Okay. And again, it's not necessarily black or white. It's just things that you have to spend time with and process and think about. And they should, again, they should emerge some. Any other thoughts or questions you guys have? Anything I can clarify about the assignment or anything you can think of? Okay. I'm not hearing any, so I want you guys to be able to touch base within your group, see where you guys are at, and come up with a plan on working through this. Hopefully, you all know me enough by now to know that we have a tentative due date for this assignment. What, the end of the month, sometime, I think the 25th. Qualitative analysis is sometimes difficult. And so if you need more time with that, that's okay. I will grant you an extension. Okay. I just want to be able to be here and help. So I just want to, if anybody's, oh, we're only at codes and we need to create this. And I know you guys have so much going on with your IRBs and those kinds of things. So if we need to bump back that due date, or if you want to bump back that due date, let me know, and I'm more than happy to comply. Okay. All right. Keep up the good work. I think Dr. Dooley's coming up with a lecture here. So I'm going to sign off here, stop the recording, and let you guys do what you need to do. Thanks, guys. I hope today was helpful.